So let's talk about plot now. Plot is the thing that happens in your story. It's the action, right? What is the conflict? So every story has to have some kind of conflict. And you may have learned this before, but sort of the main types of conflict in a story pretty much be categorized into a few things. It's either person versus person, so you have a conflict with another person versus themselves, which is like an internal conflict, a struggle. Maybe you're struggling with a decision about a career or going back to school or moving or something like that. Maybe person versus animal. And lately there's been a newer one added, which is person versus machine. So think about that. What is the conflict? I think most of you are probably going to have person versus person or person versus yourself conflict in the story, but make sure it's clear to your reader what your conflict is. Does your introduction kind of set the tone and gear up for the action and the plot and the conflict that's going to happen? Make sure you set that up. Do you have a climax in your story? That should be the moment where there's the most suspense or the greatest tension. You're going to read about exploding a moment in this unit, which is when you take one small minute or one small thing that happens and you draw it out and explain it in a way that sort of puts it in slow motion so that your reader feels like they're really there with you. That's a good time to do that, is at the peak of your story when the most exciting or interesting or suspenseful thing is happening. And then the resolution, of course, is the story's ending. Sometimes resolutions are not written at the end of a story. You can organize your story a bunch of different ways, but it does need to have some kind of end to the conflict. How does it end? What happens? Where are you leaving the piece? And a so what statement just means, why did this matter, right? Why did this conflict matter? Why is this piece an important story to tell? That's something you want to leave your readers with at the end. Include only those moments that are really essential to your story. So, especially if you're writing about something that you were there for and you're the main character, you might want to describe every detail, but think about what's really important for your readers to know to get the gist of the piece. And really just focus on those descriptions and those details and exploding those moments, because those are the things that are going to be most engaging and leave your reader with something to think about. Unnecessary details, what was going on in the background, not so important and might detract from your story. And then, like I said before, exploding moments, play with time by slowing down those important moments and then skimming over things that maybe aren't quite as important. So this is just a quick image of a story arc, and you probably have learned this before, but I just wanted to give you a refresher that all narrative stories follow this arc in one way or another. Sometimes stories are written where you start the resolution and then the whole story is a flashback, and that's fine too. But no matter how you place it, it can always be organized in this chronological way where there's this hump in the middle, and that is the peak moment of your story. So you start with the setup, or as sometimes people call it, the starting world. What is the life like? And so I'm going to use Harry Potter as an example here, because I think probably most people know at least enough about it to follow along. So the beginning of Harry Potter, in the first story, he's living with his aunt and uncle, and his life is miserable and things are bad. And so that setup is things are bad. He's living with these people, but they don't feel like his family. He really doesn't know who he is or where he came from, right? And then the incident that sets things off is he gets this letter that tells him he's a wizard and he's going to this school, and his whole world changes, okay? Then he goes, the rising action, he goes to the new school, learns all of these new things, gets to know these new people, discovers all these new things about himself. The peak moment of that story is probably when the troll happens and he figures out, I'm trying to remember, it's been a long time since I've read that one, defeats the troll and kind of figures out some stuff about himself as a wizard, succeeds at that. And then at the end of the story, resolution is like he feels like he's a part of Hogwarts in that world, and he sort of feels like he's found his people, and he learns a little bit about his parents and where he came from. And then at the end of the story, summer happens and he has to go back to his aunt and uncle's house. So you can kind of see that story arc happening. And if you think of any Disney movie or pretty much any story, you can put it into this context. So your story, though it's going to be much, much shorter, it's going to follow the same kind of arc. So think about how you're going to build up to your important point and how you're going to come back down. This is just a listing of this story arc so you have a better view. But remember that in a well-developed story, no matter how long or short it is, there's the surface level story. So in Harry Potter, this is that being at the aunt and uncle's house, learning he's a wizard, going to Hogwarts, fighting the troll, going back home, right? That's like the physical things that happen in the story. But under that, there are these layers of things happening within Harry. And the real story is about him learning something about himself, figuring out who he is, and kind of being on this long search for learning who he is and where he came from. And so you've got the surface story and the underlying story. And so your piece is going to have something like that too. You might have a story about baking with your grandma, and that's the surface level piece. But what is that really about? About you learning more about your heritage or something like that, right? So think about that. What are the two? You're really telling kind of two different stories. So what are they? If we look back at that alligator story, you look at the surface level plot. This boy is going fishing with his dad and his brother. They go to a dangerous part of the lake. They lose the fishing rod. They go back to look for it. Dad makes them go back to look for it. They fail to find it. Dad finds it. Years later, dad passes away. And this boy who's now grown takes his own kids out on the boat in the lake, right? That's kind of the surface level plot. But when we peel back the layers of the story, it's really about this boy kind of figuring out who his father was and what fatherhood is like, I think. So he's afraid of his dad a little bit because his dad does all these crazy things and makes him do all these dangerous things. He tries to be brave to impress him, and he fails at that. And oftentimes in stories, and especially longer drawn out stories like movies, the protagonist fails many times, at least 2 or 3 times before they succeed at the thing that they're trying to do, before they actually make that change in themselves as a character. So he fails at it at that point. He thinks his dad is trying to kill him. Years later, he becomes a father. He gains this better understanding of his father and what it means to be a father. And so that's where his change happens in himself, right? And then he takes his own kids on a lake and he ends up doing the thing that his father did. But there's a little bit of a difference this time. It's subtle, but it's really important, where he says the line, "I won't let it hurt you," which is something that his father did not say, right? And so while his father let him be terrified, he is kind of rewriting the story for himself, and his change is that he's taking what his father taught him, but he is making it a little bit more gentle with his own parenting. So you've got very different surface level and underlying stories, but they really come together and they really kind of highlight each other. So how can you apply this to your own story? Think about, who are you or your character? Who is your character in the story? What is the action plot? What is the surface level thing that's going to happen? But what does it really mean? What is the underlying layer here? What's your conflict, and how are you going to fail or succeed at it? And then what changes? How do you, or how does your main character change as a result of this story? All right, so that is the basics on plot setting and character development. Please make sure you watch the other videos on Exploding a Moment and Thought Shots and Snapshots, as they all kind of play into this too. These are all ways that you can really do a lot to improve your narrative pieces and really make them shine.